Welcome to Things You Don't Know, the podcast where we take stories, history, science, and culture and ask what they reveal about the world around us. Today we are looking at two dystopian novels that imagine societies trying to preserve themselves by limiting certain people. One is Christina Dalcher's Vox, a novel about a future America where women are restricted to 100 spoken words per day. The other is Elizabeth Moon's The Speed of Dark, a near-future novel centered on Lou Arundel, an autistic man pressured to undergo an experimental treatment that may make him normal, but may also change who he fundamentally is.
These are very different books. Vox is openly political and oppressive. It gives us a government that controls women's speech, education, work, and public lives. The Speed of Dark is quieter and more internal. Its pressure comes through medicine, employment, social expectation, and the idea that disability or neurological difference should be corrected.
So, in one book, women are literally silenced. In the other, autistic people are not exactly silenced, but they are treated as problems to be managed, corrected, or made useful.
Mhm.
Both books ask a disturbing question. What happens when a society decides that some people must be controlled in order for the society to feel stable?
Yeah, that is our central theme today, the dystopian logic of preservation. These books show societies that claim to protect order, productivity, family efficiency, or progress. But underneath those claims is a darker idea that freedom is acceptable only for people who fit the approved model of humanity.
Let's look at the basic premises. Let's begin with Vox. Christina Dalcher imagines a United States where women and girls are forced to wear counters that limit them to 100 words per day. Women lose access to work, education, public influence, and independent self expression. Girls are no longer taught to read and write in the same way as boys are. The society is built around a rigid patriarchal order, and language becomes the battlefield. The publisher's description of Vox emphasizes that women are limited to 100 words per day, are removed from jobs, and girls are denied advanced literacy education.
Now, that 100 word limit is terrifying because speech is not just communication. Speech is identity, it is resistance, it is parenting, it is science, it is friendship, it is the ability to say no.
Exactly. And Dalcher makes the control visible. The device on the wrist becomes a symbol of state power. It turns language into rationed resource. Women are not merely discouraged from speaking, they are technologically monitored and punished. Now, compare that with Elizabeth Moore's The Speed of Dark. The main character, Lou Arundel, is an autistic adult living independently and working in a specialized corporate environment. He has strengths, routines, perceptions, and relationships that matter deeply to him. Then he is offered, or pressured actually, toward an experimental treatment that may improve or remove his autism. The question becomes, if Lou changes his neurological identity, does he become more free, or does he lose part of himself? Penguin Random House describes The Speed of Dark as a near future story about Lou Arundel, an autistic adult offered an experimental cure, quote, that could make him think and act like everyone else, while raising questions about whether he would still be himself.
And that is the first major contrast. In Vox, the dystopia is loud, official, legal, and public. In The Speed of Dark, the dystopia is quieter. It comes through the language of improvement, treatment, employment efficiency, and social comfort.
That's right, Dr. Deneen. Now, one society says women must be silent. The other says autistic people would be better if they were changed. One is domination by law, and the other is domination by normalization.
Both books involve control, but the justification differs. In Vox, the government claims to be preserving traditional family order. Women's silence is presented as a form of moral restoration. Men are public actors, women are private caretakers. Girls are trained into obedience before they can imagine alternatives.
This is a familiar pattern in dystopian fiction. The ruling power rarely says, "We are doing this because we enjoy oppression." Instead, it says, "We are saving civilization." The language is usually moral. It appeals to family, stability, religion, national survival, or the protection of children.
So the government in Vox turns inequality into virtue. Women are told that their silence is part of a higher social order.
Yeah, imagine that.
Mhm.
And the brilliance of Dalcher's premise is that the word limit attacks the roots of personhood. If you control language, you control memory, teaching, dissent, affection, and identity. A woman can still be physically present, but she is politically and socially erased.
In The Speed of Dark, the society is trying to preserve a different kind of order, productivity, and normalcy. Lou's workplace benefits from autistic employees' abilities, especially pattern recognition and focused analytical skills. But that acceptance is conditional. The workers are valued and even indulged for their usefulness, not because they are fully respected as complete human beings.
So Lou's society is not saying, you have no value, but it's saying, you have value as long as your difference benefits us, and as long as your difference does not cost too much. So basically, you're expendable.
Yeah, it is an important distinction. The danger in Moon's novel is not simply hatred, it is a conditional, conditional acceptance. The autistic workers have supports, but those supports can become a form of containment. The company likes the results of the neurodivergent thinking, but it does not fully honor neurodivergent
So
existence.
both societies are preserving themselves by narrowing what counts as acceptable humanity. In Vox, an acceptable human is male, verbally free, politically active, and dominant. In The Speed of Dark, an acceptable human is neurologically typical, efficient, socially predictable, and medically improvable.
Now let's compare the tools of control directly here. In Vox, the most obvious tool is the word counter. It is physical, wearable, measurable, and punitive.
And that matters. The word counter turns oppression into data. It makes every sentence count against a woman. A mother talking to her child must choose her words carefully. A scientist explaining her work must ration her speech. A girl learning to think must learn to be silent first.
The other tools in Vox are education restrictions, employment restrictions, religious political indoctrination, and the restructuring of the family. The society does not only silence adult women, it reaches into childhood. It teaches boys and girls different futures.
So the system is not just punishing rebellion, it is trying to prevent rebellion from ever even forming.
Yep, that is correct. That is one of the most frightening aspects of dystopian control. It tries to shape imagination. If a girl is denied words, books, education, and role models, she may struggle to imagine freedom before she even has a chance. to fight for it.
Now compare that to the speed of dark. The tools of control are less dramatic. There is a workplace organization. There is medical research. Then there is managerial pressure. There is a cultural assumption that autism is a defect to be removed rather than a difference to be understood.
And that makes it feel more realistic in a different way. Nobody has to put a shock device on Lou's wrist. They just have to make him feel that refusing treatment is simply unreasonable, selfish, or backward.
Yes, Moon's novel is powerful because it understands soft coercion. Lou may technically have a choice, but the choice is shaped by unequal power. His employer has authority. Medical experts have authority. Society's definition of normal has authority. When all those forces point in one direction, the freedom to choose becomes rather complicated.
That is a major contrast between the novels. Vox gives us direct Orwellian coercion. The speed of dark is more like Brave New World. It gives us pressure disguised as opportunity.
Both novels ask who owns, who owns, who owns the person. In Vox, the state claims ownership over women's voices and, by extension, their bodies and minds. In The Speed of Dark, medicine and corporate power seem to claim partial ownership over Lou's neurological identity.
Now, Dr. Weaver, that is interesting because Vox is about speech, while the speed of dark is about cognition and perception. But both speech and perception are deeply tied to selfhood.
Exactly, Chandler. Speech is not just sound, perception is not just brain function. These are ways of being in the world. Dalcher asks what happens when women are denied voice. Moon asks what happens when an autistic person is told that his way of perceiving reality is unacceptable.
And the question in Moon's novel is not simple. Medical treatment can be liberating. Many people want treatments that reduce suffering or expand ability. The ethical problem arises when treatment becomes an expectation imposed by others, especially when the goal is not the person's well being, but society's comfort.
So the issue is not all, oh, treatment is bad. The issue is who defines the problem and who benefits from the solution.
Exactly. If Lou seeks change for himself, that is one moral situation. If Lou is pushed toward change because his employer wants lower costs or because society dislikes differences, that's quite another.
That also connects with Vox. If a society says women are better when silent, obedient, and domestic, then oppression is disguised as moral improvement. If a society says autistic people are better when they appear normal, then erasure can be disguised as care.
Now, in Vox, language is the center. In the speed of dark, normality is the center. But maybe those are connected somehow.
They are. Language decides what a society calls normal. If the dominant group controls words, it can label one group virtuous and another dangerous. It can call obedience purity. It can call silence dignity. It can call forced conformity treatment.
That is why both novels are about naming. In Vox, women are named as subordinates. In, in The Speed of Dark, autism is framed as something to be cured. The language used by power becomes part of the control system.
So dystopia does not begin only with the police or machines. It can begin with vocabulary.
Yes, words prepare the ground. Before people are controlled, they are often described as problems. Women are too emotional, too talkative, too disruptive. Autistic people are too strange, too rigid, too costly, too different. Once the label sticks, control starts to look reasonable.
And this is where the books overlap strongly. Both show societies that are uncomfortable with complexity. Women are complex. People on the autistic spectrum are complex. Human identity is complex. Dystopian systems prefer categories: obedient wife, productive worker, normal citizen, corrected patient.
Now, let's look at some present day similarities. We do need to be careful here. We are not saying that the present day is exactly like Vox or exactly like the speed of dark. Dystopian novels exaggerate. They sharpen trends so we can see them more clearly.
But the parallels are real enough to discuss. In terms of women's rights, Vox echoes debates over reproductive autonomy, education, public speech, and women's roles in society. In the United States, abortion access remains deeply contested after the overturning of Roe v. Wade. KFF reported that as of April 27, 2026, abortion was banned in 13 states, with several others enforcing gestational limits between 6 and 12 weeks.
And internationally, the parallels can be even more direct. Afghanistan under Taliban rule has placed severe restrictions on women and girls, including in education and public life. UN Women reported that Afghan girls around age 13 are banned from secondary school, and women are banned from universities.
Yep, that matters because Vox is not only about a word counter, it is about what happens when a society decides women's independence is a threat. The tools may differ, but the logic is recognizable. Restrict education, restrict speech, restrict movement, restrict work, and then call it social order.
For the speed of dark, the present day similarity lies in debates about disability rights, workplace accommodations, neurodiversity, and medical ethics. The United States Equal Employment Opportunity Commission states that disability discrimination laws forbid unfavorable treatment in hiring, firing, pay, job assignments, promotions, training, and other employment conditions. It also notes that reasonable accommodations may be required unless they create undue hardship.
So our society already recognizes that disability discrimination exists. That means that Moon's novel is not inventing the issue from just out of nowhere. It is asking what happens when legal protection exists, but cultural pressure still says, oh, you should be more like us.
And the relevance has grown as autism diagnosis have become more visible. CDC data published in 2025 estimated that about 1 in 31 8-year-old children had been identified with autism spectrum disorder based on 2022 tracking data.
Greater visibility can produce progress, but it can also produce backlash, misunderstanding, and pressure to assimilate. The central question remains: do we build a society flexible enough for different minds, or do we pressure different minds to fit one narrow model?
Now, Dr. Deneen, that is the connection between both books. The present day issue is not only whether people have rights on paper, it is whether society respects their full humanity in practice.
Yeah, one of the most important points in both novels is that oppressive systems often present themselves as protective.
In Vox, women's silence is presented as protection of the family, protection of children, and protection of social morality, but it is really the protection of male dominance.
Now, in The Speed of Dark, the cure is presented as protection of the autistic person's future, maybe even as progress, but it may also protect employers and society from having to adapt.
That is a key comparison. In Vox, society controls women by removing rights. In The Speed of Dark, society controls autistic people by defining their difference as a problem requiring correction. One says you must be less. The other says you must become something else.
Both are forms of erasure. Women in Vox are erased from public language. Lou risks being erased from his own inner life.
That may be the deepest link between the two novels. The target is different, but the method is similar. Take away the person's authority over themselves.
Yeah, let's talk about resistance. In Vox, resistance begins with voice. Jean McClellan's struggle is not only personal, it is also maternal, scientific, and political. She wants to protect herself, but also her daughter and other women.
That is very important. In Vox, the oppression is collective, so resistance must also become collective. A society-wide silencing requires a society-wide response.
In The Speed of Dark, resistance is more internal. Lou struggles to understand what he wants, what he fears, and whether the treatment would be a form of growth or loss.
Yes, Moon gives us an ethical dilemma rather than a simple rebellion plot. Lou is not merely fighting villains, he is examining identity. The novel respects his inner life, which is itself a form of resistance against a world that often treats autistic people as puzzles to be solved rather than persons to be heard.
So resistance in Vox is about reclaiming public voice. Resistance in The Speed of Dark is about claiming the right to define oneself.
One is let me speak, the other is let me be.
Let's make the contrast very clear. In Vox, control is gender based, it is legal, technological, religious, political, and domestic. The system wants women to become silent dependents. In The Speed of Dark, control is neurological. It is medical, corporate, cultural, and psychological. The system wants autistic people to become more acceptable to the neurotypical majority.
In Vox, the state fears women's voices. In The Speed of Dark, society fears autistic difference. In Vox, the ruling order is preserved by reducing women's power. In The Speed of Dark, the social order is preserved by pressuring difference to disappear.
And in both cases, the society claims it is being reasonable. That may be what makes dystopias scary. They do not always look insane to the people living inside them. They often look organized, moral, efficient, or scientific.
That is exactly right. Dystopia is not chaos. Dystopia is often order without justice.
Let's look at what these books warn us about. Both books warn us against confusing social comfort with moral good. A society may feel more comfortable when women are silent, but that comfort is built on injustice. A workplace may feel more efficient when autistic workers are managed or changed, but that efficiency may come at the cost of dignity.
They also warn us about small steps. In Vox, the unimaginable becomes normal because people adapt, deny, or wait too long. In The Speed of Dark, Pressure builds through reasonable sounding choices. Nobody has to announce, "We're erasing you." They can just say, "We're helping you improve." Yeah,
That is,
right.
yeah, that is why these novels remain useful for discussion. They do not merely ask whether oppression is bad. That's obvious. They ask how oppression becomes acceptable. They ask what language is used to sell it. They ask who benefits. They ask who is expected to disappear.
And they also ask whether a society can truly call itself advanced if it preserves order by narrowing human possibility. It's precisely because of that rigidity that both systems collapse. In Vox, Dr. McClellan is recruited for a federal project and undermines the structure of her society and her oppressors. In The Speed of Dark, a different outcome happens. Lou Arundel voluntarily chooses the treatment after all the pressures are removed, making for himself a self-chosen change.
So when we compare Vox and the Speed of Dark, we see two different dystopian paths. One silences women, the other pressures autistic people toward normality. But both are about control.
Both societies try to preserve themselves by limiting freedom. One limits speech and education. The other limits identity through medical and corporate pressure. One uses the language of morality, the other uses the language of progress.
And both books remind us that freedom is not only the right to exist physically. Freedom is the right to speak, to think, to work, to learn, to refuse, to choose, and to define one's self. A just society does not preserve itself by making women smaller or by making neurodivergent people disappear or conforming. A just society preserves itself by making room for the full range of human voices, minds, thoughts, perspectives, and lives.
And maybe the warning is this: when a society says, "We only want what is best," we should stop and ask, best for whom?
And when a society says this is necessary for order, we should ask what kind of order requires someone else's silence.
That is a question both of these novels leave us with. Thank you for listening to Things You Don't Know. If this episode made you think, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, and return for more challenging and interesting topics. Come on back and see us. Bye bye.
Bye bye.